So hello, everyone. My name is Natalia Forrat, and this is one of the book talks sponsored by the Center for Emerging Democracies and the Center for Russian and Eastern European Studies at the University of Michigan. So I'm introducing myself because we have only one mic for the speaker. So I am currently a lecturer at CREAS, and I worked on this book that I'm going to talk about for a long time, but also during my postdoc time at the Center for Emerging Democracies a few years ago. So I want to thank everyone who came today to this room. I also want to thank everyone who is online. I want to particularly thank Erica Frantz, who is going to serve as a respondent. And I totally understand that responding to a book is a much bigger task than responding to a paper. Okay, so let's talk about the book. The book is about authoritarianism, which unfortunately is not becoming less important in the current world. And for many Americans, it's hitting very close to home, of course, these days. And many colleagues who study Russia now are trying to compare what's going on in Russia and what was going on in Russia some years ago and what is going on in the US. So my book is about Russia, but the theoretical model I develop allows us to, one of the things it allows us to do is to see how different American society is from Russian society, fundamentally different. And at the same time, that authoritarianism is possible in both types of societies. So we know that authoritarian regimes vary a lot. They vary a lot more than democracies. And there are a lot of useful classifications out there of authoritarian regimes. So what I do in this book, I turn our attention from the usual kind of criteria used for classifications, such as structure of the regime, the group that holds power, to society where this regime is being built. So I claim, the main thing that I claim here is that different social norms lead to the formation of authoritarian regimes with opposite qualities. And I think when we talk about authoritarian power, the main question is, how do people in that society see the state? And there are two basic answers that I'm providing. In one answer is when they see the state as their team leader, as their collective leader, as the center of their identity. They expect the state to take the leadership in solving all kinds of collective problems. It does not necessarily mean that they're always happy with how the state does it, but the default option is that it is the role of the state, it is the job of the state to do that. And I call these societies statist societies. The other answer is when people see the state as an outsider, as an outside player. So it's not the center of their identity, as their identities lie with non-state communities, maybe ethnic communities, maybe religious communities, maybe some other local communities. But the state plays the role of basically the source of perks and punishment. And I call such societies anti-statist societies. These are two ideal models. Of course, they form a continuum along which we can place different countries. And the important distinction between these societies that's related to authoritarian regimes is that autocrats must use different tools, absolutely different tools, to build authoritarian regimes in these types of societies. So in statist societies, they use teamwork logic. And using that teamwork logic, they build top-down organizations penetrating society. They use the cooperation of individuals in society to do that and to control society at the end. In anti-statist societies, they use a different logic, the utility maximization logic. And they form bottom-up clientelistic networks with multiple layers of brokers. And that's the way those authoritarian regimes function. And juxtaposing these two models allows us to better see the contrast between authoritarian regimes that are inherently competitive, for example, Venezuela, and authoritarian regimes that are inherently non-competitive, such as Russia or China. So now let me kind of develop this argument through first telling you the empirical story from Russia, and after that, kind of telling you the theoretical implications of this empirical story. So for the empirical part of my book, I compared 4 Russian regions. That is the Kemerovo region, the Republic of Tatarstan, the Rostov region, and the Republic of Altai. I used the nested analysis design that started with my previous research that uncovered the role of teachers in the resilience of regional political machines. And this is the scatter plot that I used to pick my regions for case studies. I picked 2 regions above the regression line and 2 regions below the regression line. In the regions above the regression line, the political machines were a lot more resilient than I expected. And in the regions below the regression line, the political machines were a lot less resilient than I expected. So I wanted to see why was there a difference. So I did field work in all of these regions. And the main takeaway from that field work was that people in the regions above the line and below the line viewed the state differently. And because of that, these regions had different kinds of political machines. So in the regions above the line, people viewed the state as their team leader. And remember, these are the regions where the electoral performance, the resilience of political machines was more stable. So when state officials reached out to people in these regions with a request about some kind of public project, people's reaction was usually, okay, let's do it. The state was seen as working for the public good, and people considered it kind of their duty to help the state. Even if they didn't always like it, it was considered the right thing to do. As a result, it was easy for the state to recruit grassroots activists for various state-led projects. These projects were often politically neutral. For example, it could be a donation drive to help poor families buy school supplies, or a public campaign for road safety. But among the many civic-minded projects, there were some that were political. They were usually related to the electoral support of the regional governor, the United Russia Party, or Vladimir Putin. So this way, the regional authorities in the Kemerovo region and Tatarstan were able to create top-down, unity-based political machines. These machines were fueled by the energy of civic activists and the societal pressure to individuals to do the right thing, to support your team. So in these kinds of political machines, the political was blended into the civic. In other words, the political pressure went through the same organizations and people that fulfilled many public and community building functions, such as schools, neighborhood associations, or pensioner clubs. These organizations worked in their public capacity in an everyday basis. But during the election time, they were repurposed to work as political machines. Most people who participated in them did not even distinguish between these civil and political capacities. I found a good example of such top-down political machine in the Kemerovo region. So the capital of the Kemerovo city had a network of community centers and residential councils. A residential council in Russia, not only in Kemerovo, is a small group representing the residents of a certain area that comes together to work on neighborhood issues. It has some limited legal rights that help these councils to do things about local infrastructure or deal with utility companies and so on. Many Russian cities have at least a few of such councils in the neighborhoods with particularly active citizens. But in some cities, there were a lot more of those councils than in others. So Kemerovo city is the absolute champion among the Russian cities in terms of the number of residential councils. For 500,000 population in 2016, it had more than 7,700 councils. These 7,760 councils were comprised of almost 24,000 volunteer activists, which means that every 23rd person in the city was an activist of a residential council. So why so many? It turns out that the development of this organizational network was spearheaded by the city government. The city administration began creating residential councils in 1997. They did it by reaching out to most active citizens in the neighborhood and suggesting to put together a council that could work with the city administration on various issues. And the people in Kemerovo generally thought that it was a great idea. So after creating a few hundred of these councils, the city administration probably realized it was getting too difficult to keep in touch with all of them. And 3 to 4 years later, they started creating community centers. And they increased their number to 47 by the late 2000s. These community centers were supposed to serve as a link between the residential councils and the city administration. And they were staffed with salaried municipal employees. So what did these community centers and residential councils do? They did pretty much all kinds of community work that you can think of. They organized cleanup Saturdays to make neighborhood look good. They organized holiday celebrations and sports competitions. They supported hobby clubs and children's activities. They organized donation drives for the poor families. They organized public lectures on various topics, from local history to legal and health issues. And this is an incomplete list. So in the process of their work, community centers were always in touch with the city administration. City officials sometimes participated in the events organized by community centers and frequently used them as an organizational basis to get feedback from the population and to communicate their own messages. But here it gets trickier. It was not only the city officials who used the community centers to organize town halls, but also the current deputies from the United Russia running for re-election. And needless to say, the political opposition never was able to use community centers for the same purposes. These community centers also helped the authorities to monitor dissent and to co-opt the most active citizens before they had a chance to join the opposition. And during the elections, community centers and residential councils helped to campaign for the governor or Putin or the United Russia and to mobilize the loyal voters. So the same residential councils and community centers that worked for the public good and community building also worked as political machines by blending political capacities into the civic ones. So let's now turn to the regions below the regression line. So there, the political machines were less reliable, and the situation was the opposite. People viewed the state as an outsider at best, and a predator at worst, definitely not as their team leader. Their teams were different. Usually it was some kind of local community or clan or an ethnic group. In Altai, for example, it was indigenous clans. In the Rostov region, it was different ethnic communities and Cossacks who had a strong identity. So in these regions, the right thing to do for the people was to cooperate with the leaders of these non-state communities, that is, their informal leaders. People would not cooperate if state officials asked them to do something, but they would do it if their informal leaders asked for the same thing. So what happened when the state officials needed people's cooperation? Well, they had to negotiate with the informal leaders because they were the only ones to whom the people would listen. And these informal leaders would bargain with the state. So say state officials ask to support Putin's candidacy at the election or some candidate from the United Russia. So these informal leaders would ask for something in return to their community. For instance, in about, like in one instance about which I heard in Altai, they asked for a minivan. In another instance, they asked to fix a water pipe system in the village. So these informal leaders played the role of brokers, and the bargains with multiple brokers added up to clientelism-based political machines. So such machines heavily depend on the ability of the ruler to either satisfy the material demands of the brokers or have enough repressive capacity to silence the communities that would not cooperate. These machines are about buying loyalty and repression, not about civic duty and teamwork. So let me now give you an example of this. So I'm going to read a quote from an interview with a former municipal official in the Rostov region. He recollected how he tried to convince the people in one of the villages to sign up for some municipal initiative, and people would not agree until their informal leader told them to do so. Quote, in Sovietsky district, where I worked, there is a village Stepanovskaya, 11,000 people. It was impossible to get their cooperation on anything. Even during the Civil War, Budyonny was extremely surprised that this village was not burned down. He just couldn't do anything with it. And it remains the same today. I tried to obtain community support on different issues, gathered them in a public hall. It was packed. There weren't enough chairs. And I spoke for a long time trying to convince them until I almost lost my voice. They applauded. I get out and they say, thank you. Everything you said was right. But we, Stepanovцы, are not going to do that. We are going to do exactly the opposite. But you just agreed. Well, we simply felt bad for you. I could not understand what they needed, but then it occurred to me that I should have dealt with the informal leaders. It was either an ataman or the head of a block committee. I began to work through them. They repeated my words exactly, including commas and periods, and were immediately cheered by the people. Everything gets done. And you don't need any gatherings and discussions. I tell him, say in your own words, and everything gets done in 3 seconds. Any issues, social ones, and even fundraisers. The authorities should not try hard to convince people. You may be 1,000 times right and convincing, but they're not going to do it anyway. But if their own person says it, they will go over and above. So this illustrates how people would cooperate with their community leaders, but not with state representatives, whom they do not consider their own. So now let's see how these two models I described translate into more theoretical terms. So the argument in the existing political science literature goes approximately like this. Here's an autocrat, and here's an individual. And most existing theories think of their relationship as driven by perks and punishment, or by buying loyalty and repression. And this is a kind of contractual relationship between two autonomous parties, each of which is trying to maximize its utility. Oftentimes, this is a zero-sum game. I win, you lose, I win. Well, I lose, you win. Another thing that is also known in the literature is that besides this relationship with the autocrat, people also have their informal communities. And the relationship of individuals with these communities is very different. These communities are important for their identity, for the understanding of where they belong. They expect a safety net from this community and pay back with loyalty. So here the logic is the logic of teamwork. We either win together or we lose together, like in a family. This is very different from utility maximization. And this schema certainly works, but only for the cases below the regression line, in the Rostov region and Altai. And there, the political machines were less reliable. The question now is, how can we adjust the schema to reflect what I observed in the cases above the regression line, where the political machines were more reliable? So we still have an autocrat, and we still have the individual. But what is different now is the position of the group. If in the previous model, the group was separate from the autocrat, now that it is positioned together with him. The autocrat is viewed as the leader of the group to which the individual belongs. Accordingly, the relationship of the individual with the group is also projected onto the leader. It is not the utility maximization contract anymore. It is a relationship of group loyalty. So resistance to the autocrat in this situation is difficult, not only because people may be materially dependent on the regime and be afraid of overt repression, but also because they may feel like they will betray the country if they turn against its leader. So they do not separate the country from the state. And this is one of the main roots of the seeming obedience of Russians. So what is the implication of these two models of authoritarianism for our understanding of democracy? So I argue in my book that democracy is not a pole on a scale between democracy and authoritarianism, but rather the point of balance between strong society and strong state. And admittedly, this is not a new idea, but I think we rarely analyze what exactly happens when the system leans one way or the other. So if the state is weak, then the political regime is prone to develop into division-based authoritarianism. And in this situation, different factions in society tend to tear it apart and divide it into us and them, undermine the provision of public goods, and bend the rules in their favor. To democratize, such societies need to build national unity, develop more solidarity, generalized trust, and the idea of equality before the law. The national unity will strengthen the state and build the regime and bring the regime closer to democracy. If, on the other hand, society is weak and the state is strong, then the regime tends to develop into unity-based authoritarianism. Here, there is a lot of national unity, but very little separation between the nation and the state. Since the state is the people's nation, they are unable to prevent their own state officials from abusing society and becoming the privileged class. The democratization path for such society is different. It already has a lot of national unity, but it needs to separate the nation from the state. People need to learn that they can trust the leaders who are not associated with the state and who can maintain the institutions of accountability, such as a functioning parliament, and work to limit the power of the state and prevent the overreach. So if we have both conditions, a unified nation and a nation separated from the state, they will make the democratic institutions function properly. So obviously, Russia is heavily leaning towards the unity-based authoritarianism. And the erosion processes that we are observing in the US are actually going in the opposite direction, towards the division-based authoritarianism. So fingers crossed, they're not going to arrive to their destination. But I hope that kind of allows us to understand how different Russia and the US are. I'll stop talking here. So I think what we're going to do, Erica is now provide her comments, and then we will skip to Q&A, right?
Yeah, just so you can audible to our audience online too.
The argument slide. Sure. Very first one? Yeah.
Am I all set? Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much for having me. And Natalia, I really enjoyed reading your book. It provides a much different perspective than what I'm used to reading. And that's one of the central contributions that I'll get to in a moment. So in terms of the way that the book starts off, I don't know if everyone had a chance to read it, but there's this nice motivating example where she compares Venezuela and Russia. And in my line of work, we tend to think of those two regimes as similar, where there's one person who's in charge and has a lot of political influence. But Natalia goes on to describe the ways in which these regimes govern atop very different societal structures. And that those differences mean that we're going to see differences in levels of political competition. So in Venezuela, elections can be really tightly contested, and in Russia, we don't see that sort of thing. And the argument that she has up here helps us understand why. That in Russia, we have a statist society where we're going to see this unity-based authoritarianism, and that in Venezuela, there are more class divisions. We don't have the same sort of state allegiance that you see in Russia. And so you're going to see this more divided-based authoritarianism. And, you know, like I mentioned, this is kind of one of the nice contributions of the book, is it really flips the way that we think about authoritarianism. In that generally in like mainstream political science, we're going to be looking at elite dynamics and the sorts of institutions that structure how elites and the leader might bargain and make policy. But here we're looking from the bottom up at some of these historical and long evolving developments that lead to state society structures that are different. So that to me was a really nice way of complementing. I don't think that this runs counter to what some of the other big pieces in authoritarian politics literature would say, but it complements it nicely and can help us better understand some differences in authoritarian strategies, as well as different policy choices that they might make. On top of this, the argument is very clear, easy to follow. If you haven't read the book yet, it's very easy to follow the line of reasoning. There's some nice tables throughout, and it is all supported by this really in-depth fieldwork that must have taken an eternity as you're reading through it. It's really impressive and very persuasive. There's this nice, you got into it a little bit here today, but this really nice case selection where we have these 4 regions in Russia that really help communicate the basic logic of the argument. There's all sorts of kind of humorous interviews peppered throughout as well. You had one of them here where they said, well, we're just trying to be nice, you know, that get at these nuances that are part of the argument. So very impressive piece of work. I really appreciated reading it and seeing this perspective. And I came out of it with a fuller portrait, I think, of how authoritarian politics works, which is great. I have some questions, which is a good thing, given that you don't want to come out of something without any questions. So one of the central questions I had was about how we see rulers interact with these existing state societal structures. So the perspective seems to be that over the long course of history, societies evolve, and we get to this point where you either have a statist society or an anti-statist society. But I'm curious about the degree to which rulers themselves might try to shape these different societal structures. So the impression that comes out of this is that you would really rather have this unified system of governance, because everyone, if you're a leader, everyone is doing what you say. So you get them to turn out the vote for elections and cheat on your behalf and all of these things, that it seems like you really would prefer that statist, teamwork, loyal version of authoritarianism. So to what degree do leaders themselves try to mold society to get in line with that vision? You know, the other question kind of related to this that I had is that in the case of Russia, we have this regional variance. And you wonder, in those regions that are anti-statist, this seems like this would be very threatening to the Putin regime. So you have individuals pledging their loyalty to their team leader, and that team leader is not Putin. So it also raises questions about when and under what conditions do leaders try to repress those specific regions. I don't know enough about Russia to know the broader relationship there. But you'd think that we would see regimes seek out strategies to try to get rid of any of this kind of divisiveness, because it seems like this would be very threatening, that you have individuals who are so easily or so closely attached to people who aren't the regime leadership. And that gets at another question I had about how it is that regimes try to cultivate group authority, which seems like a really valuable asset for any authoritarian regime. Okay, so as I mentioned, one of the things I thought was most compelling about this is seeing the way that these state-society interactions can influence regime survival strategies, and you get into the way in which they influence the nature of grassroots political organizations. And I wanted to know about, it probably falls outside the scope of the book, but how does this culminate to affect regime survival? So it seems like this status model is more durable, perhaps. But then again, you get into these other points about how some of these regimes can be unpopular, which is something that I'm going to circle back to. But I'm curious about the implications of this for how long these regimes are going to last. How do these different anti-status societies, how do they view their opposition, and what sorts of strategies do they pursue on that front? Okay, so I mentioned that I loved the way that you used the 4 regions, and it also raised a lot of questions for me about how you can have, so in the zoomed out perspective, Russia would be considered a statist system, but you have these anti-statist regions. And I had some difficulty wrapping my head around how both of those things could be happening at the same time. So is it really a statist system if you have all this subnational variation? How can you have that when you have this overarching unifying based authoritarianism? So, and then I also was curious about whether in practice you can see the reverse, where you have anti-statist system as a whole, like Venezuela, with some subnational statist regions. I'd be curious how you think about all of that sort of intricacy. And then the last kind of question I had was about civic duty and team loyalty, and how that works with these regimes sometimes being very unpopular. So you mentioned that a lot of these statist unified systems are not popular. So why are people then, so loyal? So, how are they both loyal and hate the regime at the same time? Does that moral sense of allegiance to the state trump any discontent they might have? And I thought about your really interesting study with the teachers. And it sounds like the teachers mobilized on behalf of Putin, sometimes out of fear, not necessarily out of their loyalty. So how does that, fear of losing your job work with the civic duty argument? That was another question that I had. And you get into that the Achilles heel of the unifying system is that it can fail to produce high levels of really true support for the regime. So how does that get reconciled with this concept of civic duty and teamwork? And I said that was my last point, but I have one smaller point. I was curious about, most of the focus is on Russia, and I was curious about what are other typical types of statist and anti-statist contemporary authoritarian systems? What would be the norm today? Has there been an evolution over time? Oh, actually, and that did get at a point I forgot to mention with when do we see changes within a country in the type of system over time? So you mentioned Iran on a few occasions in the book, and do we think of 1979 as being this systemic juncture? Under what circumstances do we see that sort of deep societal change that can shift a place from an anti-statist to a statist sort of view? Okay, so those are my main comments. And again, I really enjoyed reading this book and found the fieldwork very impressive. And congratulations on a great project.
For a Q&A, and I'll let Natalia field her own questions. And if you could kind of, for our audience online, maybe before you answer, just kind of briefly summarize the gist of the question, because the audience won't be able to hear the questions. They don't have microphones.
Okay.
Another good reason to keep your questions on the briefer side, because it's good silence online.
Should I maybe first respond to some of,
of course.
And then we can take more questions.
Absolutely.
So Thank you, Erica, for a lot of very insightful questions. And yes, some of them do fall outside of the scope of the book, because I totally wish I could do a lot more research on other countries, because I also have a lot of questions. Actually, one of the discussants in my book panel in a conference that took place in the fall said, you know what, I came out from reading this book with more questions that I came in with. So, and I actually think it's good. It's good. I think it's provoking more thinking, and it should be productive. So to address some of your questions, how do rulers interact with these social structures? Can they shape them? They absolutely want to, right? And we know some, at least, I read a study, for example, in Mexico, where PRI was trying to force curriculum, through schools that would cultivate that kind of unity. It didn't go very well because there was a lot of resistance. And I actually, when I was doing my field work in the Rostov region, the anti-statist region, I was like, at that point, I didn't have my argument all, cleared up, but I was getting very frustrated because I couldn't understand why officials were behaving in such a different way from like the Kemerovo region. And I confronted them pretty much directly, like, why don't you do this? And they looked very puzzled. To them, it's not an option. It's not something taken for granted. It's not, they were like, that's not serious. No, we cannot do that. That's pressure on business. Like, no one is going to take this serious and no one is going to cooperate with us. Basically, they intuitively knew that this is the situation, and frequently they just go the easiest way and don't try to shape because they don't have this long perspective. At the regional level, of course, you can understand it. But at the national level, you can see how if a party like PRI, for example, monopolize the power, and they have much longer perspective now, then they do try to build that unity, absolutely. It's just not easy to do. So we continue to see attempts, and it is constant pull and push. So,
Follow up
yeah.
quickly. So do you see that as like the dominant strategy of these authoritarian leadership groups, that they are going to try that as their first line of defense?
Again, I wish I knew everything about all the countries. So I can't speak to whether it is a dominant strategy. I think autocrats do have agency, and some of them consider it important and some of them consider it less important, and they learn. I totally saw the learning curve of the governor of the Kemerovo region, who initially, when his career was starting, he did not realize how important that kind of everyday work with the population was. And he lost his first election, the first competitive election in the Soviet Union, he lost it. And then gradually he understood that there must be very systematic work in that region. So I guess it depends also on the experiences of the autocrat, what kind of things they encountered, what they have in their mind. So I totally see they can attempt it. I don't know if it would be, if it is empirically the dominant strategy right now. So very interesting question about whether anti-statist regimes in Russia threaten Putin's regime. Here, Russian federalism actually comes into play, because there are ways, like, Putin does not govern directly in every single region. There are governors, right? And he basically makes it the job of the governor to figure out how to control the region. And with some anti-statist regions, let's take Chechnya, like one of the most anti-statist regions you can ever imagine. And there, the way to control that region is basically to install the person who can do it in exchange for a lot of money. So Chechnya, and Kadyrov personally is receiving just a lot of funding from the Russian government. Fortunately, this region is relatively small, so Russian budget can still handle it. But that's the example of how an anti-statist region is being managed. So there is this middle layer of governors, and the governors are, they're technically elected, but there are so many mechanisms to fire them, to install people who are, friendly to the regime, etc. So basically those elections aren't very meaningful. And Putin manipulates them all the time. And actually, in my research about teachers, I totally saw the role of the governors. Like the role of the amount of federal transfers to the region wasn't a significant factor in that regression. So how do regimes cultivate group authority? Well, I think it's kind of related to how they cultivate the unity in general, right? They absolutely want to do it. The regime survival in two types of societies. Well, I think since anti-statist societies, by its logic, they're just less stable. The regimes are less stable. There's more competition, right? So I would expect, again, that's a little bit of speculation because I didn't really do an empirical analysis of regime survival along those lines. But if we extend the logic, the theoretical logic, regimes should be less stable in anti-statist societies. And in statist societies, if we remember the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it was very unexpected. So those levels of discontent and double thinking and just like total like disbelief into the system reached the critical point, combined with economic crisis, with political crisis, with just like many things layered on top of each other. And that's how it just like suddenly collapsed. So I would expect regimes and statist societies to be more stable on average, but probably collapse a lot more rapidly when they do collapse under a combination of circumstances. How are people both loyal and disloyal? That's like one of the essential questions that I was struggling with. And you're absolutely right that some teachers cooperated because they just didn't want to lose their job. But there were also enough teachers who would say that, well, you know, we should just help do the right thing. And people can be both fearful and believing to this party. You know, when I'm discussing this group authority and how much power this group authority has over the individual, I'm bringing a few examples, like, you know, imagine a woman in a very religious community. It's not that they're absolutely dumb not to understand that their rights are being, you know, violated, and they frequently want to do more than whatever religion and community allows them. But at the same time, they have such an attachment to this community, and there are so many things that are dear to their heart that is related to this community, that it's really difficult to live in this contradictory situation. It's basically an abuse from a trusted party. So one of my pieces that were based on the book, but were basically for wider audience, I called, or rather the editors called that piece, the state is the parent that beats you. And that basically captures it pretty well. So, you know, if the parent beats you, it doesn't mean that you're not attached to the parent. You can be afraid of the parent, but at the same time be attached and have some feelings, you know. And that's how that's the best way I can explain it. So yeah, I guess I'll stop here and I'll ignore some of your questions that are outside of the scope of my book. Thank you for them. Yuri, then Katerina, and then...
Thank you very much, Natalia, for so great presentation on this very rich theoretical and empirical research material. I have two brief questions. First, can you tell a bit more about the chronological framework of your work? Because you mentioned some communities were or societies were established historically, like in communities with old tradition of Cossacks or other leaders, you know, and some maybe societies were created since 1990s, you know. I don't know. So what's your frames, chronological frames, how you understand these societies historically? And second question related to these models of statist and anti-statist societies. Is it any hybrid models too? I try to explain because if both models are same tolerant or not tolerant to both internal and international policy of state, or, for example, we can say both can be loyal or unloyal to internal policy, but at the same time both can be loyal to international policy. If it's understandable, the question, or
Neutral force
Uh,
outside the region.
outside Russian Federation at all. So international policy, national policy, Russian Federation. This could be like it could be like a hybrid model when anti-statist society could be unloyal to internal Russian Federation policy, but could be loyal to international. Let's see if it's clear.
So maybe the easiest thing would be to answer, just kind of repeat just the gist of the question, so the audience online.
Yeah.
The recording knows what the question was.
Okay, so the first question was about the chronological frameworks of my study. And there are kind of two answers here. There is the chronological framework of my fieldwork, which was the end of 2013 and the first half of 2014. Basically, I was in Kemerovo region when Crimea was annexed. And I absolutely, like, that definitely imprinted into my mind. And then there is also the question about how far into the history I looked. I definitely had to look quite far into the history, sometimes a couple centuries, for each of these regions. It depends on which region. For example, the Rostov region, of course, has a very rich history that goes back centuries. The Kemerovo region, well, of course, people were there a few centuries ago, but as a region, it formed after the Second World War, like during the Second World War. And that really impacted the identity of people in the region, because they think of themselves as the industrial heart of the country. So that's how I basically did it. I took a snapshot of what I observed in contemporary times, and then I had to look into history for insights about why this is the way it is. Yeah. So whether there are hybrids, yes, of course there are hybrids, and I wish I could do research in all regions of Russia, but there are like 80 something of them, so it's pretty much impossible. And the hybrids can be different, like at different levels, of course. So I just think of this model less than just like two rigid categories where you can fit one or the other, and more just internally coherent theoretical structure that allows us to disentangle two different logics. And how you apply them to a specific case really depends on the case. Like you should follow your case rather than my model. You should only use it if it is useful. If it's not useful, just drop it, use it something else, right? So your attitude, question about the attitude to foreign policy. Basically, the question was, is it possible that, let's say, anti-statist regions, they are not super loyal to the regime, the federal regime, like the central regime, but they at the same time support the foreign policy of that federal regime? And translating into more concrete terms, is it possible that these regions are not super loyal to Putin, but they do support the war with Ukraine, for example? So I want to clarify that anti-statist societies can be very supportive of the central regime, right? If they get enough perks, if they feel fine, they're absolutely supportive. There is absolutely no reason for them not to be supportive. It's just they have more potential to take away that support. It's easier for them once the situations becomes not pleasant for them, right? And of course, if they are supportive, they are also supportive of the other, like the foreign policy. But at the same time, we should remember that there are different layers of this. There are different layers of identities. When they think about the local politics, right, they think in terms of utility maximization. They bargain with their regional officials to get this or to get that. Absolutely. At the same time, they do have a higher level identity that activates in certain situations, and that higher level identity can be pretty unifying across the nation. So we can totally hear a lot of the same ideological cliches in anti-statist societies as in statist societies. And in some sense, in anti-statist societies, they're more used to contention. In statist societies, they're more like at the very bottom, they're very solidary. They just, people are nicer, just honestly, they're nicer to outsiders. They're pretty inclusive, right? But in anti-statist societies, there is a lot of contention at the bottom. So they're a lot very used to contention. When someone is talking about contention at the international level, it is very understandable for them. So I actually don't see any contradiction between being anti-statist and supporting a war with another country. Katerina.
First of all, thank you for this presentation. It's my second time hearing about your book and being an audience of this presentation. It's really, really provoke questions more and more. So my question is about religion in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if religious landscape reflects what you observed. I mean, Russia is really a multi-religious country, Muslims, Christians, different Christians. And have you observed church leaders being that leaders in the communities or not? And just in general, what place church has in all of this models and life?
That's an excellent question, actually, because I absolutely observed religious leaders being leaders in their communities in both types of the region. I think the question here is not whether it is religion or not religion. I think the question is, what's the relationship between religious institutions in that region and the state, right? So oftentimes, let's say in Tatarstan, well, Tatar state is actually, it's actually pretty secular. They're really trying to maintain the balance between Muslims and Christians in the region. They, like, the state officials purposefully stay relatively neutral. There is some kind of informal agreement between Muslim leaders and Christian leaders that they don't congratulate each other with like religious holidays. So there are some rules that everyone follows. But generally in Russia, church is very much subjugated to the state. So whenever, like, the church has, like, it goes back to the 16th century, right? To the schism of the 16th century, where basically the state was getting stronger and subjugated through some reform religious institution, the church, to the state. And since then, actually, I think it pretty much stayed under the state. The church has never developed into a separate authority that could counterbalance the state, unlike it did in Europe, for example, and many other places. So that would be my answer.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Cavalier. I'm a Europeanist, not American.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know anything about Russia. So, but I'm fascinated. This is so much better than the stuff I had to read in grad school. It just speaks much
Thank
better
you.
to me. But I'm gonna push it coming from your nice provocative statement about the United States. Like, so what does it tell us what's happening in different, let's call them Western democracies? So the way, and I haven't read your book yet, but the way I'm interpreting this is a little bit of a Hirschman voice exit loyalty. And so I would say in statist societies, there's two ways to maintain control. You kill the alternative option. So you force people, like, there's no choice. Or if there is choice, you're just more convincing teamwork. So in American literature, they call it linked fate. I don't know if you've heard that concept. There's this idea of, if everything goes well with Putin, everything will go well with me, right? So I kind of, that's the, so, and then in the anti-statist societies, either there are these credible alternative options and you need to co-opt them, kind of get somewhere. So the issue is really about exit. to some extent.
Mhm.
In the state is you kill the exit option. That's one way to maintain power. And there it's there and you need to co-opt. And so I'm thinking about the United States today, where it would go. And I think what's worrying me a little bit is that I do think the exit options are provided by market mechanisms at the moment. And for some reason, if markets sustain themselves, we're gonna slowly move into an autocratic system because we have other forms of insurance that are not either our group or the state. Or at least for a decent subset of the population. And so I'm wondering, in your cases, were there enough variation in economic options that you could potentially speak to my, or is it the same, which is you cannot rely on a third institution called markets, where you could accumulate wealth, self-insure? And so to some extent, you have no variation on that. You have enough variation on that you could speak to my intuition that I think we are going to move into autocracy, because there is an option which is not studied in your book, which is market institutions for self-insurance. That makes sense. I know you summarized that for them.
Yeah, so the question is basically whether, when we think about developed countries, whether we should take into account the presence of the market and basically think about it as an exit option when people wouldn't want to go with the state or some other group, but rather seek their safety net in market forces, right?
A decent subset of the population, not everybody. But
Yeah. So yeah, obviously this is like outside of the scope of my book, but I think of the research about depoliticization in the US that I read many years ago, and maybe that actually speaks to what you're saying, that some subset of the population is becoming depoliticized. And partially because, yes, they don't have to rely on communities for their just, physical survival, let's say. I honestly think that market cannot completely replace group identity, because you need not only food and shelter to survive, you need kind of meaning of life. So, but then how this is going to play in a society where you do have a lot of pluralism. You can potentially find some niche groups and communities where you can express yourself and find like-minded people, but not necessarily be involved in politics. So that could probably happen. And I remember I was very recently reading some research, some survey results about the swing voters, and they are increasingly the ones who do not have a consistent ideology in the United States, right? They're liberal on some issues, they're conservative on other issues, they don't associate with any party. Maybe this is what you're talking about. So can't say I have a strong opinion about
So
it,
no
but it's
variation in market.
Sure there is. I mean, think about Timothy Fry's work, right? Okay, so I just want to build on Charlotte here, because what your intuition is, which I think is a really interesting one, is kind of the opposite of what most of the authoritarians in literature would say. Because what most of the authoritarians in literature would say is, well, what you really need is some kind of strong private economy and market, functioning market, so people have an alternative. Because people would look at this and say, well, sure, it's a state of society because they've got oil and because they've got all the state-backed revenue. So there's simply, well, yeah, you're loyal, or you're just accessing resources or what have you, because that's the fundamental nature of the economy. So the idea that what a market could be instead is some kind of a bit like exit, or in Hirschman's terms, more like an exit valve, a safety valve that would dissipate, is kind of a countervailing mechanism. And what's interesting is, so I don't know if you know Tamila Lankina's work at LSE at all, but she does this work on like this history of Russian descent. And what she kind of amazingly describes is the way that all of these non-believers, these non-conformists, like Russia has this amazing history, which is a lot like American history, honestly, of these non-conforming religious groups that go to the periphery, go to the frontier, go to places where they're not particularly can't be tightly governed, and escape the writ of state authority. But then the big question for her work, and I think it's interesting here, is, so is that dissent or is that just like autonomy?
Because you can be autonomous, you can have no connection to the state, but you don't have either the imperative or the resources to then attack state authority with that, right? You're just separate. So these are really different questions of whether groups are to some degree autonomous from state authority, but then whether also do they have exit options, but also do they have any resources or will to actually challenge state authority if they're able to go elsewhere?
Yeah.
So it's kind of heads you lose, tails I win. But it does seem like it's worth thinking about, because like Fry and Reuter have all this stuff on how employers in Russia will coerce their voters, right? So if you work for a state-owned enterprise, they can basically coerce you to vote for Putin, right? So there is work on it, which does then vary. There are company towns in Russia, there are non-company towns in Russia, right? So you could think about that variation too. So maybe the simplest way to put it, does that variation map on in any way, like that in the United States that you don't have the company town dynamic, state-owned enterprise dynamic, that kind of thing. Therefore, people can have other strategies of survival.
Yeah, I think that market issue and the variation, I think it very much speaks to the problem of Moscow, because Moscow is actually pretty difficult to explain. It has the best labor market probably in the country, from bottom to the top. It has a lot of resources, and it has, on the one hand, quite a bit of liberal-minded people. On the other hand, compared to the population of Moscow, it's tiny. The share of those people is really tiny. So even though you see the largest demonstrations, you used to see the largest demonstrations in Moscow, if you think of how many people live there, that's actually not that big. So, and I think probably in Moscow, that's where we absolutely see that kind of depoliticization and retrieving. To a degree, the whole Russia was doing it in the 2000s when things just got better economically and people started just living their lives, earning money, going for vacation, things like that. So, and that played a role absolutely in providing Putin a path to consolidate his regime not through coercion, but basically through that kind of loyalty. But speaking to what Dan was saying about communities that run away, absolutely that happens. It has been happening in Russia for, centuries.
People leaving the country.
Yes, it's happening now too. And that happens generally when, especially historically, when the states are developing their capacity. And there are always, remember Zomia and all these things, right? When communities kind of run away from the state. But you're absolutely right. I agree that if they run away, that doesn't mean that they're going to challenge the state. They just want to be autonomous. So, yeah. Okay, please go ahead.
Okay, yeah, but thanks for the presentation. I especially like your animated slide on the relationship.
Yeah, everyone loves the animation.
And the public, and I noticed there are intermediaries, of course. So in non-authoritarian Southeast Asian nations, of course, the role of these political brokers or political intermediaries is very central to the success of electoral success, for instance.
Yeah.
So I'm curious in your work, how strongly related or not these political brokers or intermediaries are to their public or their communities? And are these relationships defined, say, by familial, religious, ethnic connections?
Okay, how strong they are?
How are the relationships between the grassroots communities
Oh.
and the intermediaries
Mhm.
are defined?
So, okay, the question is about the role of brokers and their relationship between with the communities they basically broker for, right? So those relationships in Altai, for example, where the indigenous Altaian population is about 30%, and all the indigenous Altaian population is basically divided into clans. And that's where we absolutely see familial relationships. If there is a village and there are two clans and they're competing, that's one situation. If there is a village with one clan, there is no competition. Everyone is absolutely expected to support their relatives. I was told about a case when the relatives finally voted against their relative, but it took a lot of abuse of power for all the relatives finally coming together against this one individual. But generally, that was the example of familial kind of community, right? So then in the Rostov region, there are definitely ethnic communities. Interestingly enough, I was kind of shocked, and people, my colleagues in Rostov were shocked when I told them that by just like official statistics, 87% of Rostov population identify as Russian. And they were shocked because they always thought of Rostov as a multi-ethnic region. And I finally figured out that, well, first, some of the Russians there, they, identify as Russians, but they're actually very different Russians. Like they could be Cossacks, for example, and they think of themselves as very different Russians. And those communities that are left, some of the population doesn't get into the statistics, but also they live close together. They form actually those communities. They have their organizations, they have their leaders, and the let's say the municipal authorities, they're in constant contact with those leaders of communities, because that's the only way they can govern, right? They give them whatever rooms for official gatherings of their organizations. Universities are in contact with the leaders of those communities because there are students from their ethnicity, not necessarily from this region, but let's say coming from the North Caucasus, whom they need to take care of. And they use the authority of these ethnic leaders to basically discipline those students. So there are different ways. Sometimes it is just purely just a local community, very strong local community, that has been in place for at least decades, if not centuries, and they think of themselves as somehow different. They identify with this locale, right? So that's how they connect. And frequently, okay, not frequently, but I've encountered a few cases when inside those communities, it's almost very statist. It's like very authoritarian. Any election, 98% of support, And the leaders of those communities pride themselves on that. Like, I was talking to this municipal official whom I quoted before, and he was telling me about such a case where, he worked for some leader who always got like 95% plus on election. And when at some point I said, well, in Rostov, usually I see more variation in electoral results, which is true. And I thought I was making a compliment to the region because it's more democratic. And he thought that I was trying to challenge their abilities to get elected. So yeah, that was pretty funny. Liz.
Yes. Congratulations on your book, and thank you for the time. I was curious, in your fieldwork and people that you've talked to among the Russian population, is there a sense of the regional variation, like, and they wouldn't put it in these terms, but is there a sense, like, if they were to look at if someone would look at a map, like that region is more democratic than that one, or like, and I know sometimes, Chechnya is known as an outlier. That's kind of pretty well known that that's just completely extreme. But do people think about,
do people realize how different the regions are?
or do they talk in this respect, like in terms of how loyal or not loyal to this?
Okay, so the question was whether people in Russia realize that there is a variation along these lines between regions, along statist, anti-statist lines. And the answer is absolutely no. People think that things are exactly the same in those other regions as they are in their region. And that that allowed me to tease out in the interviews when I kind of confronted them, like, in that region, this is what I observed. And by the reaction, I could see, whether it is acceptable in this region, like how they respond to it, what they think about it, and what is taken for granted. So, yeah. Jindai and then what's on.
My question is basically a sequel book.
Okay.
So educated as an extension of the book logic. When in a statist society, when does the team logic break? When does that solidarity relationship between the autocrat and social groups and individuals break. Our baseline understanding usually comes from the anti-statist societies when the situations get bad and when the autocrats cannot fulfill their promises, that transactional logic turns into a breaking point. But if the same logic doesn't apply to statist societies, what would be the factors that could lead to a breaking point of the solidarity?
Some kind of weakening of that identity. And, you know, the economic difficulties could help with that weakening. Because if you think about, let's say, the Russian Revolution and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they both happened during the economic crisis. The economic crisis certainly contributes to this idea that, well, you know, the state is not is not the leader anymore. We need something different, right? But at the same time, what we're seeing is that even when it breaks, then it takes a little bit of turmoil, you know, 10, 20 years, and then it still comes back. Because that's the deeply held assumption that the state should be the leader, right? So other than that, honestly, I don't know how to exactly answer your question, because it would be great to look into different periods of crisis of the statist identities, right? And I can imagine that external circumstances, you know, wars and external economic crisis can contribute to that. But at the same time, you know, economic crisis by itself is probably not enough. It's just, you know, in anti-statist societies, it will lead to a crisis much faster, way faster. These people are not attached to the state, you know, they can withdraw their support at any time. But it's way more difficult. It's like leaving an abusive relationship with your parents. It's way more difficult in the statist societies. What's on?
Thank you, Dr. Forrat, for your wonderful book talk. So my question is somewhat related to the previous question about people's awareness of differences in the state and provinces, and might be a little bit out of scope. So I was wondering if it is a result of the information control by the authority, or the just lack of horizontal linkages between population because of the low density of population in Russia. Because if in China, which is the most capable authoritarian countries, people are still aware of the differences in each provinces. Some, for example, like some provinces are more like conservative, some are more repressive, and some might be more liberal. So yeah.
You know, I didn't mean that people aren't aware of any regional differences. Of course, they have some awareness, but you were absolutely right that there aren't that many people in Russia, and Russia is huge. So I honestly don't think that information control from the state plays much of a role here, because that's too theoretical for the state to try to tease out and control the information about it. Also, now with the internet, like, if they control something, they control it at the national scale, very rarely at the regional scale. Sometimes if they want to test something, some controls, they start at the regional level, but generally whatever controls are implemented, they are at the national level. But another factor may be that there is not a whole ton of migration between the regions in Russia. So that might be a contributing factor too.
So maybe we can wrap up with an online question.
Sure.
Two-part question from Anna Fedorov. So the first part is whether or not you're aware of any correlation between, and you work on teachers, of course. So are you aware of any correlation between levels of education and inclination to support the regime in Russia? So that's part one. And then part two is sort of about lessons learned, and whether you think that there's any implications of your research for how a society like the United States can try to sustain democracy and prevent authoritarianism.
Well, thank you for these million-dollar questions. Okay, so the first question was about the connection between education and support of Putin's regime. So as far as I remember, the more educated people tended to support slightly less the regime, but at the same time, the more educated people were interestingly more prone to propaganda. So the less educated people, they're usually just lower SES, lower social economic status. They have, less money, just less wealth. And they are generally more willing to withdraw support, motivated by economic factors, versus the more educated people, more affluent people. They stick a lot more frequently to the ideological reasons for support. And they come up with all kinds of rationalizations and justifications for it. For them, it's more of a question of identity, versus at the lower socioeconomic status, it is more of a question of just material conditions. So that's my recollection of just different surveys that were conducted in Russia, although I didn't really do it. So lessons learned for the US. Well, guys, I honestly don't have an answer to this question. How the US can overcome its division, how to develop the unifying identity. Maybe some force emerges that runs as an independent, because we see that the swing voters and the younger voters, they're much less ideologically attached at this point, but I don't have a very good answer.
But your answer is about unification. You're saying it needs to be moved in a less divisive direction.
Yes, absolutely. It has to move in a less divisive direction. And I also feel like, we do observe now a lot of the current administration is doing a lot of moves that fall into this logic of utility maximization, rewarding their own voters and basically taking resources away from other voters. And that is certainly pushing the country towards the division-based authoritarianism. That's just like the classic feature. And I believe that whatever other forces exist, they just shouldn't follow this lead. So hopefully there will be another administration. Hopefully nothing is ever forever, right? So this line of policies that divides the country, that is not something to take to continue for the next administration.
Even Putin's Russia cannot last forever. So
yes,
thanks for this amazing book. Congratulations on you bringing it all to fruition. Thanks so much, Frantz, for those amazing comments. Thanks for all the turnout. So please come next week for Rebecca Hansen's talk. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.